Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode, before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Charmed, Season 1, Episode 5, Dream Sorcerer. The episode in a nutshell is just a brief summary of exactly what's going to happen within this episode. A man uses dreams to kill the women who reject him, targeting Prue as his latest victim, while Piper and Phoebe cast a spell, leading to some personal gain consequences. We'll now go into a more detailed summary and give our opinions as we go. So this episode opens on Quake. Phoebe's entering, and as she's entering, there's a group of guys who decides to waylay her and hit on her with a few different bad pickup lines, including the classic, "When you fell from heaven, did it hurt? 'Cause I know an angel when I see one." Obviously, Phoebe plays along with them, and she says, "I'm no angel, I'm a witch, but don't tell my sisters that I've told you." And then, of course, she then joins her sisters who are already at one of the tables nearby. And when she sits down, she greets them, but they look a little bit distracted. When she asks what they're looking at, they point over where there is a couple who has been making out. And Prue states that they have been making out for the last almost an hour at this point. The screen then pans over to where they are going at it before returning back to the table, where Phoebe exclaims, saying then that saying hello, and then she can't even look, and Piper agrees with her, saying that she hates being single while fiddling with a straw in her drink. This is when one of the waitresses comes over, Sky, who then brings them their drink orders and puts its drink in front of Prue. Prue, of course, lets her know that there's been some kind of mistake as she hadn't ordered any drinks. And Sky says that she knows she didn't order any drinks. However, Prue has a secret admirer who has ordered it for her. We then pan over to Whitaker, who is leaning over the table, raising his own glass of what looks like beer towards Prue. Prue, of course, lets Sky know that asks Sky first if she can do her a favor, and Sky, of course, agrees. Prue gives her back the glass, saying that she's flattered. However, she is seeing someone right now and can't accept the drink. Sky, of course, accepts the drink back and heads back over towards Whitaker while at the table. Phoebe and Piper are commenting on Prue's change in attitude, asking if this means that she's going to become serious with Andy. And Prue says lately that she's been thinking about a lot of things, implying, of course, that she's also been thinking about Andy. We then follow Sky over to where Whitaker is sitting, and he very disappointedly comments that Prue didn't want the drink. Sky, of course, is sympathetic, says that she's sorry, but no, Prue didn't want the drink. Prue is flattered, however, she is seeing somebody else. Whitaker kind of snorts under his breath in disbelief and says, "Sure she is." Then switches his target to Sky, asking, "How about you? Maybe you'd like to have a drink sometime with him," while he pulls away from the table, and it is revealed that he is in a wheelchair. Upon seeing that he is in a wheelchair, Sky becomes a little more awkward, and she kind of stutters a bit, trying to be nice, saying it's sweet of him, however, makes the excuse that she's not allowed to date any customers. And then we end the scene there. So in this scene, we're kind of setting up for the episode who the bad guy is going to be, though we don't know that at this point. We can see that there's kind of going to be a theme of love. First, Phoebe's hit on, then Prue is hit on. Poor Piper has not been hit on in this particular episode so far, but you can kind of see where they're taking the theme of this episode, where it is going to be relating in at least some part to their love lives. We also get a nice sisterly moment where they're all together, and you can also see Prue still being unsure about Andy, which has been an ongoing theme throughout all of these episodes so far. And then with Whitaker, we kind of also start to see a little bit of his character being built. We know he's a little bit fickle. He's first hitting on Prue, but as soon as she rejects him, then he moves on to Sky immediately. We can also tell he has some insecurities because when Prue declines the drink, he kind of snorts and is disbelieving that it's that she's seeing someone, not that she's just rejecting him. And then, of course, we see Skylar, or not Skylar, sorry, Sky, kind of feeding those insecurities a little bit more because as soon as she sees him pull away from the table and that he's in a wheelchair, her face kind of falls and then she starts to stutter a bit, which would lead me as an audience member to think that part of the reason that she didn't want to date him, I mean, it could be a policy that they don't date customers, but I'd say more likely that she's using that as an excuse and she just doesn't want to date him because he is in a wheelchair because she was smiling and had like more of an uplifted face when she was speaking with him, but upon seeing that he was in a wheelchair, her face fell, she started stuttering, she rejected him, and so I can kind of see where his insecurities stem from, but it's letting us kind of know where he's at mentally as far as his insecurities as well as a character. All right, so in this next scene, Sky's finished her shift. She's at home. She's getting ready for bed, brushing her hair. Before she does climb into her bed, and we see the clock go from 1:05 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. At this point, then we see kind of like a red filter go over the screen, and she wakes up confused. Whitaker is there. He puts his hand over her mouth, letting her know that she's now in his world. He then helps her out of the bed, and she's in a beautiful evening dress. It's like a sleek kind of champagne color, made of satin, has a scarf around her neck, her hair is all done up, and he basically brings her from the bed and starts holding her and dancing with her, telling her how beautiful she looks in the dress, how he knew she would look that good. She, of course, doesn't understand what's happening to her. He then tells her that it's her dream, but it's his fantasy. She then asks, of course, where she is, as around her bed. Her bed's basically sitting on a roof. It's covered in fog. At their feet, the sky, of course, is a red scene with all the clouds and everything, so obviously very not a typical sight. He then laughs, saying that she's dreaming and he's visiting. She then confirms, "You're in my dream." And he, of course, says, "But I can make it mine," as they continue to dance, and he's spinning her, he's dipping her. She then notices that he's able to walk. And of course, he confirms this, saying that in dreams he can do anything. He can dance in the dreams, he can alter the dreams, and he can kill her in her dreams. Sky, of course, at this point starts to get a little freaked out, tries to run away. He grabs her back, holds her into his arms, and sort of dances her towards the edge of the roof, asking her if she knew that if you die in your dreams, you would also die in real life. She, of course, is telling him not to hurt her, and he, basically in sync with her, also says, basically is mocking her, saying, "Please don't hurt me. Please don't do anything," in sync with her, obviously being a bit of an a-hole. He then mentions that because she has rejected him, now she has to pay. He laughs, says sweet dreams, and lets her fall off of the edge of the building. Of course, we then follow her down as she's falling through the sky to the street below, which is filled with cars and lights, but still has that overall reddish filter over them. And lightning starts in the sky as well, just as she's about to drop, and as she is dropping, You see like red flashes, and then once he's sure that she is landing, he kind of turns away from the edge and does a little woohoo with his hands out and screams into the sky, very pleased with himself. Now, obviously, first thing to note, of course, is the overall wardrobe, the beautiful evening dress, how she's all done up, how he's in a bit of a suit, and how they dance. It's all very atmospheric. It sets a really nice scene, and you can tell that it's a dreamscape by the fact that they are applying a colored filter. And you can also get the ominous sense that it's not going to be a good dream because they specifically chose red for the filter. So I think they did a really good job with the whole atmosphere of it. The foggy rooftop. At first, you're not even sure if it is a rooftop because her bed's lying there. The ground's all covered in fog. It's only as they start dancing, and especially as they start getting closer to the edge, that you start to see that they are, in fact, on the top of the roof. And then he starts bringing up how he plans to harm them within their, like, harm Sky within her dream as they get closer to that edge. So you kind of build up to know what's going to happen without them actually expressly saying it. So they're building that tension really well. And obviously, that little cheer after he drops her, basically, this is a bad guy, no remorse, totally pleased with himself. This is the person that we are rooting against for this episode. It's confirmed, and we as the audience get an insight into how he kills early on, which I believe is pretty standard for the show, with them letting us know right away who we're rooting against. All right, so we've just finished the theme song. We're going over the city pan, seeing various cityscapes as a nice song plays, fairly classic opening, and we follow the city pan all the way to Sky's apartment, where she is on her bed in an awkward position, kind of laying there with the blankets off. And unfortunately, we do get the confirmation that she did in fact end up becoming deceased after her dream. Daryl and Andy have gotten this case. There's crime scene people around them taking pictures as Daryl kind of asks, "What do we got here?" before going into her name, Sky Russell, early 20s, waitress at Quake. Andy, of course, comments that every bone in her body's been crushed. Daryl kind of goes over the body. He's kneeling next to it, and he comments that the coroner has said it's as if she's fallen off of a 20-story building. Andy then looks around and says, "But we're in a closed apartment on the ground floor, and it doesn't look like the body's been moved at all." So, obviously, already pointing out that Whitaker's words were 100% true. When you die in your dreams, in this reality, you also die in reality. And we now are shown that aftermath that Sky, in fact, has died. Not only has she died, but her injuries are consistent with how she died in her dream, which was falling off of the building. And of course, we've got Daryl and Andy who have a bit of a mystery on their hands, as there should be no logical reason how her body would end up in that condition, in the location it is, with the details of the crime scene, and yet that is what they are faced with. So we know that Andy and Daryl are going to have a hard time. They've got a bit of a odd case, which seems to at this point be kind of their MO. They're getting all the odd ones. And we as the audience are again seeing that aftermath. We then arrive at the manor where Piper is doing her workout, following a video that she's purchased. She's following along, but she's starting to get frustrated. And eventually she just kind of throws her hands down and says she gives up before falling onto the floor, as she talks about how she's been doing these videos for 2 weeks and nothing has strengthened except her temper. Prue, who's come in, is sitting on a chair, drinking her coffee, picks up the VHS case and starts to read it. And she lets Piper know that she's found her problem because she didn't read that fine print. She then points to the video and she says it's 1995 for the video, but she forgot about the 20 grand for the plastic surgeon. Piper, of course, kind of dismisses, saying that the plastic surgeries worked, as the woman who is in the video leading the class is the most desired female in America, what every man supposedly wants. Prue tries to comfort her, saying that of course men want her. Men are not different from women. We all want what we can't have. She then goes on to say that instead of thinking about what the men want, she would encourage Piper to start thinking about what they as women want in men. Phoebe, of course, then walks in and says tons of fun, lots of heat, and no strings attached, as what she would want in a man while she's eating some cereal. Piper, who is still laying on the floor, obviously exhausted, says that what she wants is romance. She wants the long, slow kisses, late night walks, all those candlelit meals, candlelight dates, saying that she loves love. And she would take what Prue had in a flat second. Prue, of course, isn't entirely doesn't look like she necessarily agrees that what Piper would want is what she has with Andy, let's say it that way. And she lets Piper know that, of course, if she was seeing anybody, that she'd then have to deal with the family secret, which isn't exactly a normal secret. And then we move on to the next scene. Now, for this scene, obviously, it's just another little slice of life moment between the sisters. Piper going through her 2 week so far daily routine of her video, having a heart-to-heart with Prue, Phoebe coming in, joining in on that heart-to-heart. Again, kind of reinforces that kind of the overarching theme of this episode is going to be about love in a way. I mean, obviously, the Whittaker side of things, it's not necessarily love, but more like that obsessive side of love where he's harmed by rejection, starts obsessing, has to kill the women who reject him because he cannot handle it. So it's tangentially connected to love, even on that side, though not any love anybody would want to have on the Whittaker side. And then Piper, she says that she wants what Prue has with Andy. Now, obviously, we get time skips between episodes. There could be a lot more going on in between what we see. But we as the audience so far have kind of seen Andy and Prue be hot and cold, have a few issues, not communicate properly, be kind of back and forth. Obviously, there was that whole drama with not telling about the ex-wife or having that exes talk, only waiting a month when Prue had wanted to take it slow, a few other details. So I'm not sure that what Piper actually wants is Prue and Andy, because so far as an audience, we've seen a lot of their troubles, their hot and coldness, but apart from the first episode where they had their little one night stand, we haven't seen any passion, any heat, any sort of romance between the two, really. It honestly feels very cold and business-like relationship what they have, and that's exactly not what Piper has just described. So I'm not sure if that would be her ideal, really. And Prue, of course, then brings up the good point of, well, then you'd have to deal with being a witch. Though, at least in Phoebe's case, for sure, and a little bit in Piper's case, I don't know that that would necessarily be as big of a concern. Obviously, we're rewatchers, we know the future, we know it's not going to be really much of a concern for Piper, period, because she ends up with Leo. But even on like Phoebe's side, she's comfortable with being a witch, so I don't think she would have that. And it's not like they leave their paraphernalia and ritual materials and everything all over the house. You know, their house is very normal, so unless they outright said it, it's not really an issue. I think Prue makes a bigger deal of it than it is, which I feel is more for the audience and plot benefit than necessarily their benefit. But again, just to reiterate, a nice little sister slice of life scene that's reinforcing the theme of the episode. All right, so now we're arriving back at the police station to check in with Daryl and Andy, who are sitting at their desks and basically confirming what we already know about the case. They now have the official coroner report rather than just the initial statement that was given at the scene. So they are able to tell that Skye died of internal hemorrhaging, as her body had literally imploded upon itself. Andy, of course, asks if he's ever seen anything like it before. Daryl kind of hesitantly says that he has, but in jumpers, and notes that their bodies were usually found on sidewalks. Andy, of course, notes that there were no signs of any external damage that would have been consistent with any sort of fall. In fact, pointing out that she had no wounds whatsoever anywhere on her body. He, of course, while he's doing this, is reading the file. He puts it down. Morris says then maybe they were wrong. Maybe the body was in fact moved. And he gets up, sort of pacing in his agitated energy, saying, "From where? How would it have been moved?" The front door was locked and bolted. Each window had bars on it. None of them appeared to be tampered with. I'm assuming he means apart from the tampering the police had to do to get in the room and find the body, of course. And that it's very clear that nobody but she was in that apartment. However, it's clear that it's not a suicide, and it's sure not death by natural causes, which can then leave only one possibility to them. Andy, of course, comes over, leans more on Daryl's desk, and they in sync state that it has to be murder. And Morris says, "I hate when we say that," before we then end this scene. And of course, this is again just kind of an exposition scene reiterating what we know, making that official proclamation that it is going to be investigated as a homicide, and once again pointing out how there's no real logical explanation for what's happened to Skye, and how it is kind of that closed door mystery that Andy and Daryl are going to be dealing with on their side of things. All right, so we begin at Quake with Piper, who is doing the job of a waitress. She's bringing out a meal. She brings one to Mr. Manford, who's clearly a businessman, a regular customer. He's doing work. She puts the dish on the table, goes over the modifications that he usually makes, letting him know that it's just the way he likes it, before he says thanks without even looking up. And then she stands there for a moment awkwardly before going to pick up some dirty dishes off of a tray that's sitting nearby. This is when Phoebe comes in, and Phoebe asks her what she's doing, or rather why she's the one who's doing it. And Piper makes a comment about how Skye didn't show up for her shift that day, so they're short-handed. She then takes the dirty dishes, heads to the kitchen. Phoebe follows along. Obviously, once they're in the kitchen, she's been followed. Piper knows Phoebe wants something, so she asks her what it is that she wants. Phoebe, of course, lets her know that she's found a spell to attract a lover. Piper, of course, tells her to forget it. They're not going to be casting any sort of spells. But Phoebe kind of pushes and says there must be more to their powers than just fighting evil, and that she wants to start having some fun with their magic. Of course, Piper is reluctant. No personal gain. She doesn't want to deal with the consequences. Reminds Phoebe that there are consequences, and Phoebe asks how it's personal gain if they're using their powers to bring happiness to another person. Piper then asks her to pass her some more dishes before making her way over to one of the prep stations, still trying to work as Phoebe is tempting her to cast this spell. Phoebe then says that she's not talking about magic. They have their 30s to freak out about that, and that this spell is about having a good time. Piper then admits that it's tempting, as the dating seems a bit frustrating, but that bringing men into their life through a spell comes off just a little bit desperate. Phoebe, of course, makes the argument, how is asking for what you want being desperate? She says it's not, and that it's actually empowering. And she points out that the Book of Shadows says that they can reverse it at any time. We then time skip over to the manor where Piper is in the kitchen and she is preparing the ingredients that are called for in the spell. So obviously at some point she did give in to Phoebe and agreed to do the spell. And then Prue calls from outside asking, basically calling for Piper or Phoebe, and then walks into the kitchen. Piper comments, a little shocked that she's there, saying that she thought she had a date with Andy, but Prue mentions that he had to cancel before inquiring what they're doing. Piper, of course, gets awkward, doesn't really come up with an excuse, trying to, like, kind of get away with not saying anything. But that's, of course, when Phoebe decides that she's going to walk in with the book and comment on how she was wrong, that the spell didn't needed cayenne pepper, not black pepper. She then notices Prue there while she's carrying the book and tries to cover for herself. Oh, did I say spell? I actually meant recipe. But even she knows it's not going to fly, and so given Prue's look, she just comments that they are so busted. Prue then, of course, asks them what spell they're thinking of casting, and Piper, again, kind of trying to cover for herself, kind of being awkward, which is standard for her character, starts to ramble a bit. She says that she realized that Phoebe may have stumbled onto something that actually makes sense for a change. And then Piper notes that all of the spells in the book are there for a reason. And so this spell is probably harmless, an opportunity to test their powers, really get a handle on them. She then notes, why else would it tell them that they could reverse it at any time? Before going on to say all she wants is someone special in her life and that this spell will provide that exactly. Prue, of course, looks at her kind of confused, and Phoebe jumps in saying that she can translate. We then kind of time lapse to where Phoebe has supposedly off screen given her explanation, and Prue is kind of sitting there in disbelief, asking if they are kidding. Obviously, Piper is saying that they were hoping that she would join them, but Prue isn't going to be having that. She's got enough complications. She tells them they're on their own. Phoebe then shrugs, says, you know where to find us, and her and Piper leave the room, and Prue, of course, warns them to be careful what you wish for. A little bit of a foreshadowing warning. We then, of course, move up to the attic, where Phoebe and Piper have their ritual set up. We have candles on the table, a cauldron in the middle that's filled with some nice fog and smoke. Behind them, we have Kit just kind of chilling out. And they're sitting there with their pieces of paper ready to go. Phoebe asks Piper if she wants to go first. Piper says that Phoebe can go first, but Phoebe snatches her paper off of Piper, who says that that's not fair, before reading out what it is that Piper is looking for. Obviously, there is the initial man who is single, smart. Phoebe kind of makes a joke about endowed, where Piper corrects her to employed. And then it kind of goes into that romance aspect that Piper was talking about at the start of the episode. She wants a man who loves sleeping in on Sundays, sunset bike rides, cuddling by a roaring fire, late night talks, a man who loves love as much as she does. And even Phoebe kind of, while laughing through the requests, notes that she is very much a romantic. Piper, of course, is a little bit embarrassed, so she snatches Phoebe's little paper of what she's written down, and she mentions that she wants the sexy silent type, finds you driving through town on the back of a Harley at 3 a.m., man who appreciates scented candles, body oils, Italian sheets. Phoebe then doesn't think that Piper's doing a good enough job reading it, and so she then grabs her paper back and very dramatically and with feeling notes that it's somebody about hunger and danger, and even though you know all of it, you know that he'll never meet your friends or your family, that you can't stay away. And she points in kind of at the last, like, tacks on, he also recycles. And then Phoebe goes back to the earlier kind of joke about how, and I think it goes without saying, that we both want a man who is well employed, is how she puts it. Piper then calls her twisted, and then they see the spell, and Piper's a little put off by the spell. But Phoebe warns her that they are lucky because if they were men looking for women, then the spell would have required putting a piece of honey cake in a sweaty armpit for a full day, which of course disgusts Piper and makes her a little more comfortable with having to say the spell. They then, of course, say the spell, which is a cute little rhyme in English, looking for their partner, and then, the winds pick up, the fog billows out, the candles turn out, and then everything kind of suddenly comes to a stop, and Phoebe asks, "Do you think it worked?" Piper says she doesn't know, because big spells usually need all three of them. Now, with this scene, it's obviously a scene that's, well, really it's like three scenes, but I kept them together because they're all following that whole doing this spell plot. So, going back to the original, obviously Piper's extremely stressed out, which leaves her vulnerable to Phoebe's persuasion. Phoebe, of course, is trying to persuade her to go against her better judgment and perform a spell that has personal gain. When I'm watching that, I'm kind of like, why is Phoebe trying to get Piper to do it too? I mean, obviously Phoebe knows Piper's also upset about being single, looking for love, so it could just be, oh, out of the kindness of my heart, I'm going to let you in on this opportunity. Could also be so that Prue, who they expect to be angry and against it, will, maybe go easier on her because Piper's involved too. There's always the breaking rules may be more fun when you have an accomplice, or that by convincing somebody else, it kind of validates to her that it's not personal gain. It's not going to be wrong. They're not doing anything wrong. Because see, if Piper, who is a lot more strict on rules than she is, agrees too, then clearly she's right. There's no personal gain. So it could be any of those things or a combination of those things. But it is kind of funny that Phoebe wants to drag Piper into the spell instead of just doing it herself, as she has shown that she's happy to go off kind of on her own and independently to do spells in the past and suffer the consequences of personal gain, which so far in the series have mostly fallen onto her in the examples that we've been presented with. Going along with the whole personal gain thing and how those consequences seem to always fall on Phoebe, of course, she once again is trying to use their magic or find a way to use their magic in a way that they can benefit from as well, not just fighting evil, which I've said it from the start. I think that's fair. I think if you're not hurting anybody, you have these amazing powers, you're putting your life on the line to save other people, you should be able to gain some sort of benefit from that so that it's not just negative. And I understand, obviously, like, they don't want you to, like, you know, ruin the world's economy or maybe cause somebody some harm or do anything like that. But like if it's not going to harm anybody, if it's something that's just for yourself, speeding up a delivery so you don't have to wait for it, maybe winning the lottery so that you don't have to work so that you can fight evil better. These things, they aren't really harmful to anybody. I think they should be allowed to benefit. So personal gain for me was always something, even as a kid, that I was kind of like, I don't know if I agree that it should be as strict as it is. But again, we have Phoebe trying to use it for fun. We then also kind of have the hint at the fact that obviously the workplace has not been informed of Skylar's death yet, so that's what's leading to Piper being stressed. And that's some way to kind of tie it into the episode because it feels like so far it's been very separated. You have on the one side Skylar, Whitaker, Andy, Daryl, and then on the other side, the sisters are kind of more into their whole relationships and trying to find love sort of thing. There isn't really any of that connecting thread yet, so they're kind of connecting it back by Skylar being a waitress at Quake and that being mentioned. We then, of course, move into the more kitchen scene where, Piper obviously isn't as 100% convinced about everything by Phoebe as it would appear, because even though she's willing to go along with the spell, as soon as Prue arrives, she gets awkward, she gets defensive, she gets kind of in her head as she's not really sure if they actually should be doing what they're doing. And then, of course, Phoebe comes in. They all have their back and forth with Prue. I'm surprised that Prue actually lets them. I mean, honestly, Prue's not their mom. She couldn't really stop them. But, like, she's giving her warning, she's giving her cautions. When she can't, stop them, she kind of lets them just do what they want to do, staying out of it herself. But she doesn't, like, make much of an effort to stop them besides just, a few cautions and warnings. And the most apt one, the foreshadowing one, shall we say, is the be careful what you wish for. Not just in this episode, but in other episodes as well. You want to be careful what you wish for. And then, of course, we end up in the attic scene where they are then going to cast the spell. Now, of course, Kit, their familiar, is just chilling in the background, watching them as they commit personal gain. We have the whole aesthetic of the ritual, which every time that they do a ritual, the aesthetic's always, at least in these early seasons, really on point. You have the metal cauldron with all the fog inside. You have like the old thick candles with like the wax dripping down the sides of them, with like the flames. You've got, the wind picking up and stirring up that fog all around them. And then just before everything goes quiet and silent, there's like a little bit of the fog is dyed pink and then poof, disappears. Candles all go out. And then, of course, I've mentioned it before, but one of the things that I loved the most about this series was the fact that the spells were all in English. They were rhymes, like, well, not all of them, but most of them were in English. They were rhyming. They were kind of letting you in on the purpose of the spell as, a child. And it was something that, like, when you were younger, you could role play that you were a witch too, because you could write down what the spell was. And then, when you're playing with your friends, you could say it because it was there. And I just want to call it out again that that is one of the most magical parts of the show. Like, so many times when you're watching a show based around magic, the magic is always in a different language. It's othered, it's foreign, it's something that you can't understand. It's mystical in that way. But in this, they brought it back to being something that you could actually access, something that's familiar, something that's close. Your own language, you could say the spells, you could play and say those spells. You could remember the spells because they were catchy and they were in English. And as a child, I appreciated that so much. It's probably one of the reasons why it was one of my favorite shows. And I think that that's really important to call out, how that decision made the show and the magic in it a lot more accessible, a lot more real, because it was something that was familiar and close. And then, of course, there's always the spell at the end. Well, do you think it worked? And it's like, I don't know, you had a bunch of fog, you had a bunch of wind, you had the lights going out. Like, I'm pretty sure it would have worked. You had all the effects going on. Not sure why Phoebe's so confused about it. And even Piper's a bit confused about it. I'm like, pretty sure it worked. If it wasn't working, I don't think you would have had, all of that going on that went on. The phone is heard ringing downstairs. Piper and Phoebe share a look before running down the stairs, where Prue has already picked up the phone in the foyer, and they both ask if it's for them, wanting to know if maybe that was the spell working. But Prue says that this is Prue, so it implies that the phone is for her. And then she asks who's on the other line, asking if she knows them, while her sisters kind of observe her side of the call. We then move to the other side of the call where we see Whitaker in a lab coat in what looks like some sort of scientific laboratory as he's in his wheelchair, and he mentions that they had met at Quate, or rather they hadn't met, but he had sent her a glass of Chardonnay, which she had sent back, but that he still is wondering whether or not she would be willing to actually get a drink with him. Of course, Prue on her side of the phone, looking very confused, kind of upset, like angry, upset. And she notes that as she had told the waitress, she's not available, asking him how he got her number and her name. And he, instead of answering from his side, just hangs up in like a very slow, sort of creepy way. Obviously, Prue continues to ask hello, hello, but obviously she's been hung up on. Piper asks who it was, and Prue says that it was the guy from Quake who had sent her a drink. Piper, of course, asks what he wanted. Prue says he asked her out. Of course, she sounds very confused. She's obviously like, how did this person get my number? She's obviously creeped out by it. And then Phoebe, kind of in contrast, is not very concerned by this, and she goes over, gets her coat, starts to head out. Prue asks her where she thinks she's going. Phoebe, of course, says she's going to Quake to see if the spell worked, asks if either of them want to join her. Piper passes, and Prue, of course, says she's going to pass as well. We then move on to Prue in the bathtub, surrounded by candles, with the bubbles up to her neck, as she then slowly falls asleep. We then see a filter placed over the screen, this time in the color purple, or like a purpley blue. And then when she wakes up, Whitaker is there, and he says hello to her. She then asks who he is, or rather, who the hell, and then he finishes her sentence, am I? How did I get in? And she, of course, then starts another sentence that she does, like she just wants him to get out, and he finishes out of the bathroom. They then talk in sync when she calls for Piper to help her. He then tells her she can scream all she wants, but no one can help her. Prue again starts to ask a question, and he again finishes her sentence by letting her know that he's in her subconscious or her unconscious, and she knows her every thought and her every desire. When she asks who he is, he says that he's the man of her dreams, and we see the scene shift from like the purple filtered bathroom to her bathtub sitting on top of the foggy rooftop that we were at with Sky earlier, and the filter kind of changes to be a little bit more on the blue side than the purple side, and we can see that behind him the sky is kind of like a turquoisey green blue up in the sky. And he says that he's the man of her dreams. She then starts to say that you're not real, you don't exist, and she continues to repeat this with her eyes closed. He, while she's repeating that, goes on to reveal that that's something that her mother used to say every night before she went to sleep, that if she saw any monsters, she was to tell herself that they were not real, that they don't exist. He then kind of laughs at her, making his way closer. And when he gets real close, Prue wants to obviously move, but she isn't able to at this point. He laughs at her and tells her that he's going to love her to death. He then picks up a sponge, which he then drags down her back, leaving behind a bloody wound, before he then decides to push her head down under the water. She, of course, struggles, and then luckily Piper happens to come along and knock on the door. The knocks wake her up, which allows her to then rise from the tub in reality. And of course, Piper peeks her head into the door, asks if she's okay. Piper comments that she was yelling, and Prue then says that she, like very obviously confused, in disbelief, in shock, says that she had a really bad thing. Piper clarifies a thing, and Prue's still kind of confused, trying to get her bearings, says that she had a thing and that she's okay now. She promises and sends Piper back to bed. Piper, of course, leaves, and Prue then gets out of the bathtub and she feels pain. So when she gets to her mirror, she turns to look, and on the back of her shoulder, she sees that there were scratch marks down her back, which followed her into reality. So obviously, this is where we get our full connection between bad guy and the charmed ones, though specifically in this case, Prue. And obviously, it's incredibly creepy that he manages to get her name and number. Obviously, he used some sort of resources from his job and research to be able to get them, though I do also find it kind of creepy that a random lab somewhere would have access to get someone else's information. And especially as at the quake, he was never told her name. So he had to first like find out who she was, her name, and then her number. And like, how did he go about getting that? However it was, it clearly was not above board. And so that in itself is just very creepy, very stalkerish, very obsessive behaviors. And then, of course, we have to comment on like the overall aesthetic of the scene. Obviously, she's one of those people who does the self-care routine for a bath, as she has the candles lit, she has the bubbles, she's clearly just like relaxing and lounging. It's all dimly lit, very soft atmosphere. And then, of course, we go from like the nice, warm, candlelit yellowish light all the way into that, applying the very cold filter, the purpley blue, which is like a dramatic contrast to the warmth that it was before in the scene. So you can definitely know, again, kind of how with Sky they had gone from like normal coloring to a red filter and you knew something really bad was going to happen. Similar to this, they're letting you know the tone of the scene by going from like a really warm, cozy coloring into stark, cold coloring for the scene, which of course is very aesthetic, very impactful as a viewer. I do kind of think he is a pervert for doing the whole while she's in the bathtub thing. I think that's probably the show giving fan service to the boyfriends or husbands who were, you know, roped into watching it, because I do feel like the show was kind of geared towards a female audience. So obviously the female audience didn't need the fan service. That was in there for whoever was watching with whatever female was watching, obviously. I don't think that was necessary. They could have had her fall asleep in a bed as well, kind of like Sky did, but that's just a nitpicky thing. Obviously, the sponge. I'll admit, even as a child and up to today, it confuses me a little bit because, like, it's a sponge. It's clearly, like, sponges are soft typically. So, like, was this sponge happen to be, like, embedded with razors? Is it because it's a dreamscape that he was able to make the sponge sharp? I also thought maybe because after, when she looks in the mirror, it looks like four, like, finger marks clawing down the back, that maybe it was his fingers, except I'm pretty sure he was wearing gloves. So like his nails wouldn't have been exposed to be able to like actually scratch her, and he obviously had the sponge in the way. So I've always been kind of confused on how this sponge hurt her, because it doesn't seem to be his fingers because he was wearing gloves, and obviously the way he was holding the sponge was kind of to the side. The sponge itself is a sponge, normally would not be sharp, and why would it leave like claw marks? Even if it was sharp or something, would it not just be like a solid scratch, like a salt, like it wouldn't be in like four furrows, it would have been like one large wide area where it had gone down, I would imagine, if it was somehow harming her, skinning her, something like that. So I'll admit the wounds there, they've always confused me. And I feel like they could have done with being a little bit more clear on exactly what was wounding her and how that wound was occurring. Because even to this day, after multiple rewatches, I still don't really understand how she got injured there. So it is seemingly now the next morning. We have Prue and Piper in the kitchen. Prue is getting ready for work, getting her breakfast ready, and asks Piper if she remembers what their mom used to say when they had nightmares. Piper tells her that if they saw any monsters, they were to tell them to go away and that they didn't exist and that it had always worked. Prue then says, not this time, as he knew about Mom, he knew what she had told them, and asks how he could possibly have known that, and then comments on the marks on her back. Piper, of course, kind of looks disbelieving, and Prue gets defensive, saying that they were there and now they've disappeared, and she doesn't know how, and she doesn't know why, but they were definitely there when she had checked. Piper still doesn't really believe her and is trying to be kind of sympathetic, and she asks her how many hours she's worked that week and comments on her going in now on a Saturday as well, basically trying to imply that perhaps it's just Prue's exhaustion getting to her as opposed to a real event. Prue, of course, makes the excuse for going in on a weekend that one of the shipments arrived late and the auction's on Monday, so she has to, but calls Piper out for changing the subject, confirming that she doesn't believe her. Piper tries to backtrack. She says that she believes, well, not fully backtrack, but she basically says that she believes that Prue thinks she saw marks on her back, but that she is also watching her down her third cup of coffee, and it was a nightmare that she had while asleep in the tub. So most likely it's the exhaustion that made her see those marks, not a dream guy. Prue defends her position, says that he was in her dream and that it was a real dream or a real event. Piper then asks if it was real, why she didn't use her powers to help her out and move him away. And Prue, of course, kind of pauses at this, thinks about it, and comes to the conclusion that she doesn't know why. We then see Hans enter the kitchen, Phoebe's spell going right, and he, of course, is a very well-built man, and he's wearing no shirt. He walks in, greets them, good morning. Prue asks who he is. Piper says, who cares? And he gets some milk out of the fridge. He drinks it all while they kind of watch him do so. And then Phoebe comes in with his shirt all bunched up, saying that she found his t-shirt, and they have a little like good morning greeting, goodbye. And then Hans says he has to run, but before he runs, he makes sure that he puts the milk carton in the recycle bin. And they, of course, make a lunch date before he leaves. Phoebe then turns to her sisters, who are, of course, giving her a look, and she promises that they had been safe the night before. Piper, of course, says, ew, while Prue laughs. And that is kind of where we end up here. So obviously we now have confirmation that the spell worked. Phoebe has met the man who the spell was bringing to her. Honestly, he doesn't seem like a bad guy, like that she was looking for like the danger, the quiet type, all that, and he comes in very wholesomely in the morning. Hello, everybody. Drinks some milk. So I'm not sure how much he actually fit her description that she gave, but obviously, very well built man. This is back in the day when they gave you something to ogle on screen and we all appreciated it so much. There wasn't the whole let's put a bunch of average people on screen. They always did the good looking thing. And as an audience member, even as a child, and now as an adult, I appreciate that so much. But yeah, he's good looking and he made sure that he recycled. Not sure about the recycling bit. I think that was just like a little bit of comedy that they slipped in there. And now onto the more serious side of the scene where we have Prue's encounter with Whitaker being talked about by Piper. Now, obviously, Piper has no reason to believe that somebody invading your dreams is something that they can actually do. So it's understandable that she kind of points towards, the hours that are worked. We're also getting a little bit more of an insight into Prue's character, as we now know that she is very much a workaholic and she's been 60, 70 hours in a week. That is a lot. That doesn't leave a lot of time for like your personal life, which is odd because the actual times that we've had scenes where Prue is working are rather minimal at this point, yet she's supposedly there 60 to 70 hours a week. But that could have been something that they just brought in for the sake of this episode. And Piper, she's trying to be supportive, but she doesn't really believe Prue. Prue obviously is probably at this point feeling a little bit like, is she crazy? Like, she's very staunch in her, I believe this happened. I know this was real. But I can't help but think that Piper being so dismissive, well, not dismissive, but trying to give alternative explanations will probably make her second guess herself a little bit. And it also lets us know that the wounds don't carry over for long. So, like, obviously, if you die in your dreams, you're dead in reality. That's long lasting. But apparently, if you're just wounded in your dreams, it only stays around for what would seem like only a few hours. That is, it had implied that her bath time was pretty late in the night. And by this morning, she now no longer has those marks. So they probably only stuck around for, well, probably a few minutes to a few hours, but not very long at all. So she no longer has the proof to say that it was real or to really back up her claims that it was real. And I think that's an interesting thing, how the death is permanent, but any wounds that you receive are very temporary and obviously heal with no scars. So we then find ourselves at the police station with Daryl and Andy again. Andy drops a stack of files onto Daryl's desk, saying that it's all here in the FBI files. Daryl kind of reluctantly picks up the files, asking why does he do this to him. As he then goes to take a look, Andy then continues that the files are from 3 young women, all unrelated except for the fact that they all died the exact same way, which happens to also be the same way that Skylar died. Daryl, who's not really on board, kind of glances at the folders and says that the coroners classed them all as jumpers, that the cases were closed, but Andy then tells him to look at the crime scene photos. Daryl then is picking up the photos, he's glancing at them as Andy then tells him that all of them died in a locked room, not on a street where they may have jumped off of a high building, and that Andy thinks they have the MO now, or modus operandi, of a serial killer, potentially having fallen into their laps. Andy then returns back to where Daryl is with his coffee, takes a sip while Daryl looks up at him, and he doesn't say anything, so they've both agreed at this point that most likely a serial killer. Again, we kind of have that dynamic between Andy and Daryl where, like, the second scene or the third scene, there's always a point in the show where we kind of see Daryl second guessing Andy, almost like there's a trust issue there where, Andy's doing something that's like, why do you do this to me? Or, you know, I don't think it has to do with these sorts of things. Like, he's kind of like a reluctant take along, while like Andy seems to be more intuitive, taking those leaps that kind of are a little bit off the norm. And there always seems to be that kind of dynamic where they do trust each other because they are partners, but maybe not as much as they should, like with kind of Andy going off on these leads alone with this like intuitive leap type thing, and then Daryl kind of getting dragged along, having not been aware of it ahead of time. Andy just drops the files on his desk. Doesn't seem to be expecting them, and then so I feel like there is a little bit of a trust issue between the pairing. Like, they're always partners. They always solve the cases together, but they don't necessarily work in sync very well. And the tone from that very first scene where we very first met them seems to just kind of be getting more and more serious and a little bit less bantery and a little more Daryl being a little bit more sus- not it's not even suspicious. Like, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. It's not suspicion as in like he thinks Andy's doing something wrong, but it's just kind of Andy keeps going off on his own. Andy keeps coming up with these ideas and bringing them back to him after the fact that he's checked up on them, seemingly without any sort of communication of them between them. And Daryl seems to be getting a little bit tired of that. That's how I'll leave it. So we then arrive back at Quake, where Phoebe is talking to Piper about how the spell has to have worked. Piper's still not sure, but Phoebe assures her that it's definitely the spell at work, as Hans never goes to bars. However, last night he happened to get a flat tire and come in to use the phone. When who should he run into but her coming out of the ladies' room? Piper then says that that's not the spell, that's just hormones. But Phoebe assures her that it's not like that and that she has genuine feelings for Hans and he has them for her as well, seemingly. She then celebrates, runs over to Hans, who is waiting by the bar, jumps into his arms, they hug, he spins her around before they leave the restaurant. Piper continues to work and she goes over to where her regular customer from the earlier in the episode, Mr. Manford, is sitting, delivering him his modified meal, made just the way he likes it. And this time, instead of ignoring her as he had done earlier, he instead looks up at her and tells her to call him Jack, asking if she knows how beautiful she is. Piper laughs awkwardly, asks if he's been drinking. He, of course, laughs, saying that she has such a great sense of humor and he loves that. She, obviously bit put off, turns to leave, and he tells her to wait and says that he doesn't know why, but he's got to get to know her before asking her to have dinner with him. Piper tells him to hold on for 1 second and then power walks over to the phone, where she picks it up and starts dialing for Prue as a man comes up behind her. Into the phone, she talks to a secretary or assistant or somebody, asking to speak with Prue Halliwell, as she's her sister. The guy that's now hovering behind her says that she shouldn't have dinner with Jack. She asks why not, and he says because she should fly to Paris with him. On the phone, Piper then upgrades to the assistants that it is now an emergency. We then go over to Buckland's, where Prue is in her office and she's picking up the phone for Piper. Piper's obviously told her what's happened on the other line, and Prue asks if she's not actually thinking of going out with this Jack guy. This is when Rex enters Prue's office carrying a box which he puts on her desk. He starts to ask if she's finished the Cromwell miniatures. Prue then to Piper, who's on the phone, asks her to hang on a second and tells Rex that she's still on cataloging Rembrandt sketches. He then tells her to set them aside, as the letters of Ernest Hemingway are now first on the block and will take priority. As he says this, delivery men bring in stacks full of boxes of what look like document boxes, obviously filled with paperwork. Prue then puts the phone back up to her ear, saying that she can't believe it, but she's going to have to be there all night, and asks Piper to let her call her back before hanging up. We then end up back at the manor, where Phoebe and Piper are both getting ready for a date. Phoebe is putting on her shoes, Piper putting in her earrings. They're both in nice dresses, hair done, and Piper talks about how Jack had stayed through the entire lunch shift and talked her ear off, making her laugh at his stories and convinced her to have coffee with him, which is where she's going. Phoebe then lets her know that her and Hans are going to be going dancing at a club called Rave, inviting Piper to bring Jack with her to join them, but Piper kind of says if their dinner date lasts as long as the coffee break, then they wouldn't make it there until probably after closing, which of course Phoebe then changes to maybe they can meet at the house later before grabbing her coat and leaving, saying how great it's turned out for them. Piper, however, who is sitting at like a bench that they have in their entryway, looks a lot more unsure. And she does answer, yeah, as Phoebe's leaving out the door, but you can tell that she doesn't really mean it and that she is very much unsure still about the spell. Now, we are highlighting in this scene that the feelings involved may not necessarily be genuine. Phoebe believes that it's genuine. She's never had any contact with Hans before. Happy coincidence. She thinks the spell's just making that coincidence happen, but isn't really impacting their feelings at all. But where we start to see maybe this more sinister side of the spell and kind of where it is personal gain and why there may be consequences in the future is with Jack. We saw at the beginning of this episode that Jack completely ignored Piper. There was no connection, no feeling, nothing. She might have been a statue. Like there was nothing there. And now all of a sudden, he doesn't know why, but he has to get to know her. He's suddenly looking up and noticing her. A random person she's never met before at the bar is offering to fly her to Paris. I can understand where she may have those qualms, like where she's getting that discomfort from, because those are obviously, these men don't know her, they know nothing about her, yet they're wanting to do extreme things like take her to Paris, or someone who's never noticed her before suddenly is noticing her. And it does seem like once he's noticed her, they are getting along. They're laughing, they're trading stories, they've had a wonderful coffee date. But how much of that connection is real and how much is the spell kind of forcing those feelings onto those men? We then also tie back into our main plot with Piper calling Prue and Prue now being swamped with extra work that's going to take her longer, that she'll have to stay there all night, and playing into that whole exhaustion theory of like how it's going to be hard for her to stay awake, how she's going to be exhausted and made vulnerable to the main villain. And then of course we circle back to where Phoebe and Piper are talking about their dates. They're both excited about their dates, but where Phoebe is completely guard down, we see Piper with kind of her guard up. Like she thinks it's great, she's having a good time, but you can almost tell that she also feels like there could be a downside to the spell and that maybe she is feeling a little bit like something isn't quite right in the way that she responds to Phoebe asking if it's great and how she sits there kind of, yeah, very quietly and clearly in her head thinking and not so sure. We're now back with Andy and Daryl, who are visiting the sleep lab where Whitaker is. They of course question him with regards to his relationship with with the first victim to die that way, which was Julie Garrickson, who was, he reveals, his girlfriend at the time. Morris of course points out that just because he knew the first victim and dated him doesn't mean he's a killer. But Andy says that it's a good place to start. Of course, they're both shocked when he comes in with a wheelchair. They ask him again some questions, and he goes on about how hard it was, how they had dated, and she broke his heart before cutting himself off, saying he doesn't really want to talk about it. They then, of course, mention how a waitress had just died the same way she did, and he, of course, plays dumb. You're kidding, right? And then they ask where he was the night before, and Whitaker, of course, has an alibi, you know, a night's worth of data, two scientists, a lab technician, asking if they want him to page them. But of course, at this point, they don't really have anything to go on with this, don't really think or know how he could have managed it, and so they thank him for his time before they then leave. Obviously, this is just a short scene to let us know that the Andy and Daryl are on Whitaker's tail, but still not sure about themselves. We obviously get an update on the case. We learned that the first victim was somebody who dated him, and we know that he likes to kill the people who reject him. So we know most likely she was his trigger. And of course, he's taking advantage of not appearing like a killer would typically appear to kind of throw them off of his trail. He, of course, has the airtight alibi because who would imagine that he could be killing people in their dreams or that that would then reflect into reality. So it kind of gives us an update, but also not much progress. We then get a brief sort of insight into Piper and her date with Jack at Quake, where she starts to kind of go over some dislikable qualities that she's making up as she goes. You know, she talks about how when she's stressed, she gets hives, very weird places, which is nothing compared to what happens when she panics. He then tells her, "Oh, your honesty, so refreshing." Piper then mentions how, well, it helps to keep her ulcer under control. Jack says, "It's the 90s. I mean, is there anyone who doesn't have one?" She then asks about whether he'd like to see her tattoo. He asks if she'd like to see his. She then asks him, is there anything that she can say to turn him off? And Jack says that there isn't, before kind of coming to a realization that it's actually kind of strange. She then says, not really, and tells him that he's under A, but then he kisses her suddenly. The kiss lasts for a kind of significant amount of time, really. And then she finishes her sentence with spell. He obviously gazing at her happily, she glances over. Oh, there's somebody who's nodding at her, kind of giving her a wink. She then looks over to where, like, the wall is, and somebody's sitting against the wall with a drink, raising it to her. She then turns around and, oh, look at that, there's a man with a rose towards her, and she just kind of laughs incredibly awkwardly, clearly on the verge of some sort of panic and breakdown, as she ends out just sitting there, not really sure what to do. But obviously, this is where we're really starting to see that there is a sinister side to this spell. There is consequences. We all knew that, like, once personal gain was brought up at the start, we knew that there was going to be the consequences. Now we're starting to see that. We see Piper on the date. She can't do anything to put him off because his interest is supernaturally created, not natural. And of course, then there's all the people around basically waiting in line. So if it doesn't work out with Jack, well, here's 1, 2, 3, A, B, C as options. And this is, of course, Piper, the one who's going to be the one to notice, as she was the one that was more reluctant. Phoebe, I believe, is kind of in her own world with Hans and isn't probably noticing anyone around who is also kind of like that, or maybe she's used to being hit on, so she doesn't really notice it. But Piper certainly has begun to notice that there were consequences. We're then back at the Dream Lab, where Whitaker is ordering his scientists and lab technicians to put him under, increasing the settings on his machine so that he can be under for longer periods of time. And when they try to protest, he tells them it's his grant, his experiment, and they do as he says, putting him to sleep. We then move over to Buckland's, where Prue is still in her office working overtime. Obviously, due to the hours, she's already asleep. So he finds her asleep at her desk, sits in the chair in front of her, and says hello to her, that they meet again. She, of course, wakes up, grabs a letter opener off of her desk. He then continues to ask about how she works, spends all that time at work, works all those hours. She yells for somebody, and then we see that the office scene shifts back again to that foggy rooftop. This time our sky is blue with some like dots of red, kind of like red orbs around it. And once again, there's like a reddish filter to start, and now it's, because of the blue sky, a little bit less red, and it's got like kind of clashing tones there. He then asks her what she hides from at work, whether it's the pain of past, uncertainty of the future. Prue tries to get out of her chair, but she is unable to. She, of course, tells him that she doesn't hide from anything, and he kind of taunts her about not being able to get out of her chair as he grabs the chair and spins her around. He then asks if she wants to know why, and but then he just answers for himself that it's because he doesn't want her to get up, telling her how powerless she is. She tries to tell him to go to hell. He continues ignoring her, that he, on the other hand, am all powerful. If you don't want to talk to me, that's fine. There's always Piper, Phoebe, or any number of young single women out there, and it's an endless pool for, and this is where he names himself as the Dream Sorcerer. She, of course, now that her sisters have been threatened, is saying that she will stay, but he says that it's too late and she's falling asleep. She claims she's fine, she's awake. He offers her a lullaby, and she instead finally finds the ability to move, and she kicks him, stabbing his hand with the letter opener, and he, of course, yells in pain, dramatically, like swings his head about in pain, and is enraged. He then moves her chair angrily to push the chair right off of the building, as there was a conveniently placed ramp, so he is now up over it. But just before he can push her out and have her fall, the telephone rings in the office and she wakes up. Prue then answers the phone, and we find out that it was Andy on the other line, surprised that she's still at her office. She's still a little panicked from her dream, asks to call him back, and he says that sure, she can call him back. He's at the station house, before asking if everything's okay. As it's clear from her voice that something's going on, she tells him that it is now, thanks him for calling, and he tells her that he just wanted to hear her voice. She then hangs up, and Rex touches her shoulder behind her, and she, of course, panics, turns around, holds up the letter opener, and Rex is a little bit shocked by this, especially as it turns out that the tip of the letter opener and her hand happens to have some blood on it. So we get a little more insight into how he's invading the dreams, and we're learning that it's not actually supernaturally related. Normally in the series, the big bads tend to be demons, warlocks, evil, supernatural beings. In this case, it's one of the few times, and definitely the first time, where that big bad evil is actually just a standard regular mortal, and the actual vehicle for which they are committing evil is science. And this is where we're learning it. And then, of course, he invades Prue's dreams again, but this time, maybe because she's had the experience previously, she is able to find maybe not her supernatural power, but at least enough of her own power to kick him away, stab him with the letter opener, and once again we see evidence when she wakes up that some of that dream is capable of bleeding into reality, as we see that the letter opener has some blood on it, and that her fingers holding the letter opener also seem to have a little bit of blood on it. And of course, this is Rex also sees that blood, so I'm surprised that he didn't ask any questions. I mean, they didn't really give him a chance on screen to ask any questions, but then like off screen, she still has her job after. But I'm really curious what excuse she gave for why there was blood on her letter opener when she herself had no wounds, and why she was holding it to stab him when he startled her. I would have loved to see that conversation. So we're back with Andy and Daryl, who are still investigating the case. Obviously, Daryl is a bit on the fence because Whitaker is in a wheelchair. He has no motive. He has an alibi. So he asks Andy why he's so stuck on him being their suspect. Andy then lets him know that what Whitaker is researching at the lab is dream leaping, which is the ability to project himself into someone else's dreams. Morris then comments that he's projecting himself into women's dreams and then killing him, kind of in disbelief. Andy, of course, points out that it's not just any women, but those women who are rejecting him. And Julie Derrickson broke up with him while they were driving. They got into an accident, and that is why he is paralyzed now. Apparently, it was all in a police report. Andy then stands up, he goes over, he gets his coat before turning back to Daryl and saying that the day after he went back to work at the lab, Julie Derrickson died. And then within 6 months, 2 more women had died, and they were all crushed to death, so seemingly in their sleep. And he asks Daryl to tell him whether or not he thinks that's a coincidence. Morris, of course, Daryl says he would love to say that it was a coincidence, but he actually can't. So he also gets up, grabs his coat, and says, let's go. And they head out, seemingly to go back to the dream lab where Whitaker is. Now, obviously, again, we're getting kind of caught up. We're learning more about what Whitaker is doing. We know that he's in a lab. Now we learn what he was researching. We then learn how that relates to him being able to get into people's dreams. We also are seeing again where Andy is making that leap to kind of the supernatural, the occult, just a natural inclination to the weird, whereas Daryl's kind of still holding back, like, why is your brain going there even? But unfortunately for Daryl, it is convincing and he does end up going along with it. But again, Daryl's always the one that's kind of resisting that kind of occult messaging or that odd, weird side of the case, whereas Andy is the one who makes the leap to get there in the first place. However, because the evidence is on Andy's side, they go there. But I'd like to know also, like, even if they solve this case, like if the ending wasn't what it was, even if they solved this case, how would they be proving that in court? Because I mean, at this point, they're speculating that the dream leaping is actually happening and that's how he's killing the women. But do they have any proof that that's actually what he's doing? I suppose his research would let them know, but like with their research studies enough, obviously, if the lab could know the specifics of what he was doing while he was asleep, they would already know he was killing people and probably have turned him in to the police at this point. So they obviously don't know what he's doing in the dreams. So I don't know how well that evidence would hold up for him to actually be prosecuted. Of course, we know that that's probably why the ending ends up as it is, as we are rewatchers and know the future. But let's continue on to the next episode. So I meant next scene, not next episode, but in this scene, we're back at the manor. Phoebe's getting home. She comes into the foyer. It's filled with flowers. She grabs a piece of chocolate, heads towards the kitchen. Piper is sitting there drinking coffee amidst all the flowers. And she comments that Phoebe is home early, who also says that she's home early. Piper then notes that the flowers were all waiting on the doorstep when she got home and were from men she barely knew or had never even met, and that all the flowers in the kitchen are the ones that were there for Phoebe. Phoebe then sits down, kind of upset, saying that she knows none of them were from Hans. Piper asks her what happened, and Phoebe notes that Hans wouldn't leave her alone all night, and that practically every guy in the bar was hitting on her, and she finally couldn't take it anymore and ditched Hans, like leaving him at the club. Then asks about Piper's date. Piper notes that it was perfect, that everything was perfect, and even her faults were perfect. Phoebe asks her if that's a bad thing, but Piper comments that it wasn't real, and that everything was because of the spell, not because of her. Phoebe tries to be understanding, says that she doesn't know that. Maybe he had meant every word he was saying, and maybe if it wasn't for the spell, he just never would have had the chance to feel them. But Piper is very sure that love is a magic between two people. It cannot be explained or conjured by magic, and she is determined that what they have done, it was definitely not the right thing to do. We then see Kit the cat jumping up onto the table, and Phoebe, of course, saying that their poor cat is also in hell, and at all of the windows we can see a bunch of presumably male cats trying to get in. Piper says that they need to reverse the spell, and Phoebe agrees, and this is when the phone rings and Piper gets up to answer the phone. On the phone, it's found out that it's Prue. She's still at the office, and she's telling Piper that she fell asleep and that the man from her dream tried to kill her again. Piper, of course, is shocked by this, but Prue says she doesn't understand why, and she knows she's only safe if she stays awake. If she falls asleep, she's going to be dead. Piper tells her to stay where she is, and that Phoebe and her will go and pick her up, but Prue says that she doesn't want to stay in the office another minute and asks Piper to look into the Book of Shadows and see if she's able to find anything on the guy, letting Piper know that he called himself the Dream Sorcerer. We then, of course, jump to Phoebe and Piper looking in the Book of Shadows, finding nothing. Phoebe's the one who suggests that potentially he is a mortal when Piper says that the book's never let them down before. And Piper says if he's immortal, he's got a hell of a power, and Phoebe agrees that it would be, but that even if he's immortal, there's got to be some way to stop him. Once again, the phone rings. Obviously, they go towards the phone. Piper says it has to be Prue. Phoebe asks what they're going to tell Prue since they're not able to help her with anything in the book. They kind of do this, neither of them really know what to say moment. Before they then run downstairs, we then see Prue's car driving down the street, and she's obviously got a cell phone up to her ear. Prue, of course, is hoping that they're going to be picking up. Um, then we get Piper and Phoebe finally making it downstairs where they do pick up the phone, and Prue asks whether or not they found anything. Piper says unfortunately they didn't, but that they are going to do everything that they can to help her. She's not in it alone. Prue then asks how they can help her when they don't even know who he is, and Piper says that the most important thing right now is for her to get home safe. And Prue asks them to just keep talking and not let her fall asleep, as she's clearly very asleep. Well, not asleep, but very tired, exhausted, falling asleep. Piper, of course, on their side of the phone, turns to Phoebe, commenting on how exhausted she sounds. Then Phoebe takes the phone from her and tells Prue to blast the air conditioning, crank the stereo, roll down windows, before changing her mind on the stereo. And then turns to Piper asking for a song that they sang when they were little, when they went on road trips, and suggests that maybe they should sing that together. Prue on her side, of course, is hearing everything, but is still very exhausted. And Phoebe's trying to assure her that everything is going to be fine, even as she's kind of coming in and out of nodding in, nodding out. Of course, after Phoebe gives assurances to Prue that nothing's going to be happening, Hans knocks on the door, very agitated, yelling for Phoebe, saying he has to see her. She tells him to go away, but he breaks in anyways. Prue's on the other side listening to this, kind of wondering what's happening, still looking very exhausted, calling for her sisters. Hans is scolding Phoebe about her leaving him. She's trying to calm him down. He then goes on to say that ever since he met her, he can't do anything. He can't eat, drink, sleep. All he can do is think about her. We then again see Prue nearly falling asleep, calling for her sisters. And then in the car, in the passenger seat next to her, we then see Whittaker arrive. Now, unfortunately, because of Hans's behavior, Phoebe and Piper have dropped the phone, backed away, and are not there for Prue. Prue is basically coming in and out when Whittaker arrives in the passenger seat. She then swerves, hears a horn, wakes up, tries to get in touch with her sisters, but is continuing to come in and out, seeing Whittaker and then not seeing Whittaker. Hans then gets to the point where he's trying to throw an entire vase of flowers at them. Of course, Piper panics. She freezes him. They then go back to rush to the phone, but we still have Prue in the car, again, in and out, on her way to falling asleep behind the wheel. Unfortunately, by the time that Phoebe and Piper pick up the phone, Prue has already dropped her cell phone and fallen asleep. We then see Whittaker laughing as the car makes its way towards a pole, and we see that the vehicle has now hit the pole, with Prue asleep behind the wheel. It then shows like she is semi-asleep behind the wheel with her eyes closed, but she is conscious enough that she's muttering that she can't fall asleep over and over as we see the crashed car and the airbag in her head against the steering wheel. Now, obviously, with these scenes, we're just kind of getting a bunch of short back and forth snippet scenes between the characters, kind of bringing each of the plots in the show to their conclusions. We obviously have now the very obvious signs of the consequences of the spell. All the flowers from people they don't know haven't met. Neither of the dates have worked out because it's very clear at this point that it's not real what they're feeling, it's all the spell. They then agree to the right thing, to reverse that spell. And it's so lucky that they're able to reverse that spell. But then we kind of move to the second plot, or the main plot, which is with Prue, where she's obviously afraid. She's afraid she's going to fall asleep, and she's so exhausted that her judgment is very questionable. Obviously, you should never, one, drive when you're that exhausted and can't stay awake, and two, do not be on your phone while you're driving. These are both not great things to be doing, but I do believe in the time period where this was filmed, I don't think it was quite illegal yet. I don't know in California if it is illegal or when it became illegal. I know where I live, it happens to be illegal to talk on your phone while driving, but that wasn't the case in the early 90s or even the late 90s. So it probably wasn't illegal at this time, so she wasn't breaking the law, but it's still just not good idea to, when you're exhausted, drive or drive on your phone. And obviously we see the direct consequences of it when she does in fact crash her car, as would be the main worry in that. And of course, once you've crashed your car, you're kind of stranded, she's exhausted, and she's just repeating that she can't fall asleep. Whitaker, of course, this whole time is laughing at her, waiting for his opportunity. And then the sisters, they're there, they're trying to help her, but the consequences of their own mistake are now preventing them from being able to help her in the way that they need to. And that's also leading not just the consequences for them personally with Hans attacking, with obviously all these flowers, with him becoming actually actively aggressive towards them, but now Prue is kind of left stranded without her sisters immediately there to be able to help her. And that's even further consequences. Is it tied to the spell's personal gain consequences or completely separate? I feel like there may be some intersection there with the sisters being prevented from helping Prue as a consequence of the spell that they did, or it could just be completely separate. But I like to think that there is some interplay there. We then have Prue being wheeled into the hospital. The paramedic that found her at scene gives a report to the doctor that she was found semi-conscious. Doctor, of course, does all their doctorly things, gets her set up in the room, and discovers that she has now gone fully unconscious. As soon as we hear that she's gone fully unconscious, we then find that her hospital bed is now on the rooftop with Whitaker there, laughing at her, of course, and she's confused, asking if she's asleep. He's laughing at her. We see this time the foggy roof scene is all back to like the oranges and the reds, similar to how it was when Sky had died. We then have Whitaker kind of smirking at her, letting her know that no, you're not asleep, you're actually unconscious. You hit a pole, and it was a terrible, terrible thing. But he's obviously thrilled because being unconscious and being asleep are very different things, and you can't really wake up from being unconscious as easily as you can from being asleep. So he's thrilled. It shows on his face. He then goes on to tell her how she heard him last night, and not just his feelings, gesturing with his hand so that we all know it's where he was stabbed that's causing him pain. And she tells him to suffer while she's trying to dial out on her cell phone. He chuckles, pulls the phone out of her hand, and says that they're definitely out of range, being as they are in a dream. He then offers her a glass of wine, which she had rejected originally, and she of course swats it away, and he gets angry. So then he starts rolling her bed closer to the edge of the rooftop. We then get a little brief snippet break where we're back with Andy and Daryl, who have arrived at the sleep lab and are ordering the scientists to bring Whitaker out of his sleep. They tried to protest that could be dangerous, but they are insistent, and they confirm that at this point, it's not about whether or not Whitaker's the one killing women, it's who he's going to kill next. We then, of course, return to Prue, who is still in the hospital bed, but her clothing is in the nice, beautiful evening dress. It's all velvet, it's got sequins. It's a very nice dress, and he asks her if she likes it, and she just snaps back that she's worn better. He lifts her from the bed, obviously supporting her weight, which again indicates that much like with the other times she's dreamed, she's not fully in control of her actions or her body. And he, of course, is holding her. We then skip out into a new snippet where we see Phoebe and Piper arriving at the hospital, being directed to where Prue's room is, and coming alongside where her body is. Well, actually, that's a little wrong. I mean, they're told where she is, told to wait in the waiting room, and they go running to her room anyways. We then also get to snapshot back to where we see Daryl and Andy. Andy's knocking on the glass, trying to wake up Berman. Whitaker Berman is his name. I don't know if I've said his last name before at this point because I've been calling him Whitaker, but Whitaker Berman is the dream sorcerer. Andy's trying to wake him up. Obviously, he's been put under with sedatives and into a machine, so that's really not going to do anything. We then, of course, end up back in the dream where Andy's voice is coming through, and Prue is able to recognize Andy's voice while Whitaker is holding her, kind of swaying with her, nuzzling her neck, just overall being a creep. We then see that Prue and Piper have made it to where Prue is laying, and they're also trying to talk to her. The scene in the hospital room is also oranged out with the filter. As they're doing so, she, of course, inside of the dream, is able to hear them. Prue, of course, is still paralyzed. He lifts her up, starts walking towards the edge. Back in the real world, we have Phoebe saying that she's scared. Piper agreeing she is too. Phoebe asks what they can do, and Piper tells her that they're not going to let her give up before telling Prue to listen to her. And they basically tell Prue that they need her, that she can't leave them, and remind her to use her power and come back to them. Whitaker, of course, in the dream is reminding her that she is powerless and she is still appearing to be paralyzed, unable to control her own body. Meanwhile, the sister's words just keep repeating and echoing through the dreamscape as he then lifts her up to try to take her over to the edge and drop her off of it. Whitaker finally gets her to the edge of the roof. She glances down. We can see that it's very high up. Whitaker asks if he should say goodnight and kisses her on the forehead. And Prue finally starts to come out of her daze a bit and says to let her, and finally uses her power to throw him over the edge. And of course, he falls, and we see him falling. And of course, then we get to see in the lab where Andy and Daryl just happen to still be that Whitaker gains all of the injuries of jumping in his sleep and passes away before them. And Andy says that he can't believe it, but goes in to check while Daryl watches from the window outside of his sleep room. Though Daryl does note that he's never going to doubt him again, we then see back in the hospital that Prue wakes up and her sisters are there. They, of course, ask Prue what's happened with Whitaker, and she tells them that he is gone. Now, of course, with this, we get our nice wrap up of the main plot. Daryl and Andy figure it out, but of course, thank goodness Whitaker has died because, like I said earlier, how they would actually prosecute a case like this, which would be like unverifiable science, really, of like, did he, like, even if they knew his sleep studies, obviously they wouldn't have known exactly what he was doing in the dreams in order to prove that he was the one who murdered these people. It would have been circumstantial at best. He probably would have gotten away with it. So, in the end, they ended up having him be deceased so that they didn't have to worry about that aspect. And then, of course, we get the whole back and forth between Whitaker. We hear Andy, we hear all the sisters, so we know that obviously sounds can penetrate in. The sisters remind Prue to use her power, and she eventually is able to use her magic to be the one to turn the tables on Whitaker. And I think it just wraps it up nice and neat, all with like tied with a nice little bow. We then show it's daytime, back at the hospital. Phoebe and Piper roll in a cart filled with flowers, and Prue makes a comment that she hopes they're there to pick her up, but they say that the doctors advise that she needs to be in the hospital still one more day to be sure that she is okay. And Phoebe points out that it wouldn't kill her to get some rest before covering her mouth, that she made a faux pas. But of course, Prue smiles, says that it's okay, thanks her for the flowers that they've brought. She then sees Phoebe kind of making a face at Piper, asks what the face was about with regards to like the connection to the flowers, and then realizes that there was a connection to the spell. Piper and Phoebe then reveal that they had reversed the spell the night before, and that they had called both Jack and Hans, and neither had remembered anything, so everything was back to normal. Andy then interrupts, bringing in a bag of food and a single rose, saying surprise, and Prue, of course, accuses Phoebe first. Phoebe says it wasn't her. Prue looks over at Piper. She says guilty, and then gestures for Phoebe to go. And then as she's leaving, asks if they'll see her later tonight. We then see Phoebe and Piper, once they're at the door, turn back to see Andy and Prue interact. Prue's looking through the food. Andy says that it's nice to see every bone in her body isn't broken. She, of course, gets shocked, asking him what he means, thinking that he knows something, but he just comments on the fact that she was in a car accident. And then back from where they are watching, Piper gives Phoebe a rose, and we realize that Andy may have taken the rose from that bouquet and not actually brought it with the food, which seems fair. I mean, you go, you see a bunch of flowers, grab one, make it look like you brought it. This, of course, lets us as the audience know that. And again, now we're wrapping up our subplot as well. We know that it was reversed. None of the people who were involved remember anything. And so while they had their personal gain consequences, now that they've ended the personal gain, those consequences have been wiped clean. And we get a nice moment between Prue and Andy. Again, as I had mentioned before, when Piper early in the episode had mentioned how, like she wanted romance, what Prue and Andy had, this is another example of where it's a nice moment, but there's not really any passion or heat there. It could just as easily have been like a friendship moment as a couple moment. But again, nice ending. We end on a happy note, bright colors, and it's all neatly wrapped up, tied with a bow. So now we've come to the part of what is probably my longest video to date with, or at least in the Charmed series, with our rankings. On this channel, we rank into two categories. We do our mostly objective ranking list, and then we do our personal ranking list. Personal, of course, is based on the emotion and enjoyment of the episode, and the mostly objective is void of emotion, but bias and judgment still apply. So we'll get into our mostly objective rank values. To start with, this time we're going to start on the negative because this is repetitive at this point. We have personal gain. We find out there are consequences. We then feel like the characters have grown, learned their lesson, and then, oh, there we are again. Yet more personal gain, more not learning their lesson, more continuing to repeat the behaviors, especially in Phoebe's case, where she's just constantly trying to find an excuse to use her magic for not fighting evil and constantly coming against consequences and constantly not learning. This, I feel like, is a lot of character regression because every time we think they've grown, they just regress back. And that's a minor issue. So that's a -1. As for the positives, I felt like there was more world building. We learned that there are spells in the book not just about demons and warlocks, not just to vanquish, but also for other purposes besides just fighting evil. We have this love spell, for example, which wouldn't be useful in fighting any evil, but is still there in the book. And I do want to comment that it is a little bit odd that they would have a personal gain spell in the Book of Shadows that would bring about consequences, and both a male and female version, as Phoebe had kind of indicated before. But putting that aspect aside, we're learning more about the world, we're learning more about the variety of magic and the way that spells can be used, and so that would be a +4, which brings us to 3 so far. And then also I felt like this plot had a very strong concept behind it, with the dream leaping, with it being more science based than supernatural based, a mortal villain, which is not common in the series, and kind of showing that, you know, supernatural evil isn't necessarily the only evil that needs to be combated, and that mortals still, even in this universe, where there is a more supernatural fight of good and evil, mortal evil still exists, and we see that with Whitaker being a serial killer, being able to dream leap, using science to essentially create almost like a supernatural response. Like when Prue wants to fight him, she calls to look in the Book of Shadows. She calls Piper and Phoebe to look into the Book of Shadows because she assumes it's going to be supernatural because of what's happening and how unrealistic it could be, but it is. And I felt like that was a very strong concept and an idea for the series, and so I felt like that was worth 4 points. Which brings us to a total for this episode of, on our mostly objective ranking, 7 out of 10. And so in our season 1 rankings so far, we have our mostly objective ranking with Something Wicked This Way comes in first place, I've Got You Under My Skin in second, third, Dead Man Dating, fourth, Dream Sorcerer, and fifth is Thank You for Not Morphing. On the personal side, I also gave this a 7 out of 10. It is one of my more memorable episodes. It's one that I do think of frequently when I'm looking back on the series outside of a rewatch. I remember as a child looking at like the foggy rooftop scenes and thinking how magical and mystical it was. When they changed the sky, I remember thinking how beautiful the dresses were. I feel like this villain really committed. And again, we got the good-looking men to ogle. We got the overall theme of love and how you can't force love with magic or with any other sort of means. It's something that just has to happen naturally, and we're learning that lesson. But it does annoy me with the personal gain. Obviously, there are some questions that we never get answered, like how did that sponge injure Prue? Or even how the blood ended up on the letter opener when in theory it would have been a dream letter opener that she stabbed with, not her real one. That's a little bit odd. Of course, there's the how did he get Prue's name and number when that wasn't indicated to him at the restaurant and he didn't ask Sky before he killed her. There's there's just a few unanswered questions. A few little things that were kind of like, meh, about it, but overall I think both plots were strong. The main plot especially was very strong. They did something new that we haven't seen before. And of course the aesthetic and atmosphere were on point. So overall, I decided to give it a 7 out of 10, which brings the personal ranking list to in first place Dead Man Dating, Something Wicked This Way comes in second, third Dream Sorcerer, fourth Thank You for Not Morphing, and then my least favorite so far, I've Got You Under My Skin in fifth place. And so lastly, we come to our series ranking so far. The series ranking, of course, is taking the number that we rank each episode and adding it together. Once we finish the season, we will then find out percentage-wise how good that season was. And as we continue the series, those seasons that have the higher percentages will be considered the better seasons. And once we've done the series as a whole, we'll know which seasons to watch and which ones maybe to give a pass to. So, with 7 for both personal and objective rankings, we now have 40 out of 220 for season 1 on the objective side and 35 out of 220 for the personal ranking. With that, we've now rewatched and ranked Charmed Season 1, Episode 5, Dream Sorcerer. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.